Buy one, get one free, must buy special offers. Supermarkets are in constant competition for our hard-earned cash.
But farmers have long complained about retailers using bully boy tactics to drive down farm gate prices.
So who is paying the real cost of the food we eat? And how do you make sure that everyone is getting a fair deal?
Well, to discuss the issues, we've been joined here in the studio by Labour's leader in Europe, Glenis Willmott.
And the former president of the National Farmers Union Scotland, now Lib Dem MEP, George Lyon. Coming to you first, George, what are farmers telling you on the ground about the prices that they're getting for their produce?
Well, prices have been under severe pressure for a good number of years, and farmers say to me that trying to deal with 4 buyers for your produce in the whole of the United Kingdom, that they feel at a tremendous disadvantage because they are forced to finance promotions such as you explained at the beginning. If you want end of the shelf positions, you've got to fund that. And indeed, if at the end of the day there's produce that the supermarket can't sell, it's handed back to you and you've got to cover the cost of it. So it's very difficult to see how farmers can stand up to supermarkets on the one hand, of which in the UK there's 4 major multiples who are your only buyers, and all your supply industry who are of the same size. There's 2 or 3 global suppliers of fertiliser, 2 or 3 global suppliers of all the herbicides and pesticides, etc. you use. And they feel as if they're being squeezed in the middle between these multinationals on the, who buy your product and the multinationals who supply your inputs. And it's how you bring about some fairness in that food chain to give them a better chance of carving out a reasonable return for themselves.
Now, at the other end of the scale of the consumers, Glenis Willmott, isn't one of the problems that we just don't pay enough for our food? We get rather a good deal, those 2-for-1 offers and so forth.
I think that's if it's a real offer. Sometimes these aren't actually that transparent, and I think what we would want to see is we want to see farmers getting a good return for their money, but we also want to see a transparency in the pricing so that consumers also get a fair deal. We want to make sure that we stop late payments. You know, many of the retailers constantly pay farmers late, and that's another issue that farmers constantly talk to me about. So there's a whole range of issues, but it's about fairness and it's about transparency, and it's a fair deal for everybody along the chain.
Now, in the UK, the government wants to set up essentially an ombudsman. It's being called now a groceries code adjudicator. Is that going to make things better, in your opinion?
Well, it'll depend what powers they have to take action, because without powers to actually intervene where there's retailer abuse of the contracts or the terms and conditions that have been agreed to, then without real powers to sort that out, I don't think it's going to make a big difference. I would agree with Glenis's point, is the real need is for some transparency here to see who's earning the margins in the food chain. Farmers are not asking consumers to pay more for their food. What they want to see is a better and a fairer system of apportioning all the bits in the food chain. At the moment, they feel as if they've been completely squeezed. The processor and the supermarket always maintain their margin, but the farmer takes the squeeze when prices are falling and there is a squeeze on. So I think fairness, where you actually identify who's making the margin in the chain, is the first thing that would bring some order to the whole system. And it would also highlight who's actually abusing the system. If it's seen that the retailers are making a huge profit at the expense of all the other parts of the chain, and indeed at the expense of consumers in some cases, then I think the moral pressure for them to actually adjust their buying practices will come about of its own volition. Certainly the new adjudication office will help if it's got real powers to tackle where there's abuse, and that's the question we're still to be answered in terms of what the coalition government's plans are.
And that's really the key, isn't it? The teeth there. The NFU talking about their concerns over it. It's something they support, and I suppose you do too, but they say it's a shame it won't have fines, for example. They're also worried that farmers' complaints won't be anonymous. Are they things you'd be worried about?
Yeah, the anonymity is a big issue because supermarkets and their buyers have a habit of, if you complain, then they will take revenge on you by cutting you out the contract. And I know some farmer suppliers in my bit of the world don't even have a contract with one of the major supermarkets. They're told every Friday night whether they've got a contract for the next week's supply. It's as short term as that. So if you speak out and complain, you can bet your life the phone call on the Friday will not be to say, give us another so many gallons next week. It'll be goodbye. We don't actually want you to supply.
It can work the other way as well, though. It can be the manufacturers who are squeezed. And I know if there are special offers in supermarkets, often the manufacturer will be expected to take half of the pain. So if something's offered at 50p off, the producer will be expected to pay 25p. And quite often, if you're only dealing with one retailer, with one supermarket, they're the only person you sell your produce to, it makes it very difficult to deal with. And also there's the issue of own brands. There's a whole range of problems to do with supermarket own brands and how fair the returns are for producers, for farmers, for a whole range of people.
We've talked about what plans are afoot in the UK, but MEPs are really calling for action at European level with new laws, a European-wide ombudsman. Glenys, do you feel that there should be action at EU level?
Absolutely, because we now live in a global world. Our markets are global, so we need action across European borders. You know, it's no good just having action in the UK, because often suppliers are from outside the UK. And we also have to look at how people treat their workforce. In many of the developing countries, the workforce are the people who bear the brunt of some of these prices in the supermarkets, and we have to monitor that as well. So there are so many different aspects to this. It needs regulation at EU level.
So on the one hand, you've got the EU working on this, you've got the government you're in coalition with, on the other hand, also working on this. Is there a potential that you could have a conflict there, that there's too much red tape coming down on farmers, and presumably that's exactly what they don't want?
Yeah, you've got to be very careful that we actually get cooperation amongst all member states. If they are going to set up ombudsmen, it should be on the same basis. And indeed, we need European action on competition rules, for instance. We have a situation where in some countries, the UK and Spain, for instance, the interpretation of competition rules is that farmer co-ops can't be any bigger than 30% of the market. You go to Denmark and Arla controls 90% of the market, and it's the biggest competitor in the processing sector in the UK market. So there's something wrong there. There needs to be, as Glenys said, we live in a global market. Some of these retailers span right across Europe. We need consistent interpretation of the rules, especially around competition rules, to ensure that if retailers are allowed to grow on a European basis, we need to make sure that farmer co-ops can do the same, and we don't have different interpretations in different countries.
And just finally, what about the impact of all this on the end user, if you like, the consumer? Is this ultimately going to mean that the consumer might well end up paying more, Glenys?
It always does end up with the consumer, doesn't it? But I think most consumers want farmers to get a fair price for their goods. They want to see where the profit margins are. And until we see that and we have that transparency in pricing, I think consumers are happy to pay it if they know what they're paying for and where those profits go.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much, both of you, for joining us.
Thank you.